Could the United States conquer both Americas? On paper, the United States has the strongest military on Earth. It spends more on defense than several major nations combined, runs the only truly global navy, and has unmatched logistics and technology. So at first glance, the idea of the US conquering every country in North, Central, and South America sounds at least possible. But conquering is different from simply defeating armies. Conquest means occupying territory, pacifying populations, running governments, and maintaining control for years. Once you factor in geography, manpower, politics, and economics, the question becomes less about winning fights and more about whether the US could actually hold an entire hemisphere. The math. Occupation standards generally assume around 20 soldiers per 1,000 residents to maintain order. Outside the US, the Americas hold more than 660 million people. That means roughly 13 million troops would be needed just to keep the peace. The US has about 1.4 million active duty personnel. Add the reserves and it's still nowhere near enough, especially when those forces have to defend the homeland, protect bases, train, and rotate deployments. Technology helps, drones, satellites, AI surveillance, but none of it can man checkpoints, manage neighborhoods, search houses, or interact with civilians. The US can win conventional battles almost everywhere. It cannot magically produce the millions of people needed to police 2 continents. So how could this actually play out, with that manpower problem hanging over everything? Canada. Canada's population is clustered near the US border. Most cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver are exposed. US air power and armored thrusts, tank-supported ground pushes, could seize them quickly. Historically, invasion planning even focused on cutting key transport hubs, like Winnipeg, to split the country. Canada's military is highly capable and professional, but small and underfunded. It isn't built to fight a full-scale war against the US. After the initial shock, resistance likely shifts north. The Arctic is vast, poorly connected, and extremely difficult to police. Small guerrilla groups could operate there for years, possibly with quiet outside support. Meanwhile, internal politics might split. Some regions might cooperate more than others, like Alberta, while others resist hard. At that point, it stops being a fast campaign and becomes a long and costly stabilization mission. All right, moving on. Mexico. A conventional invasion of Mexico is straightforward. The US has air superiority. Mexican forces lack dense air defense networks and heavy armor. Critical infrastructure could be taken rather quickly. Mexico City could realistically be surrounded. And then the occupation starts. Mexican cartels already operate like hybrid armies. They control neighborhoods, build improvised armored vehicles, deploy drones, and are deeply embedded in several communities. In an invasion scenario, they stop fighting each other and focus on the occupier. In an invasion, they pivot to attacking supply convoys, planting IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and blending into dense urban areas where they have a significant advantage. Mexico City, with more than 20 million people, becomes nearly impossible to fully control. And there's also the economy. The US depends heavily on Mexican manufacturing and agriculture. The invasion disrupts supply chains overnight, driving shortages and political backlash at home long before US troops even reach Central America. At that point, Mexico isn't really a battlefield anymore. It's a slow, constant struggle to control rebel and cartel-held areas. Central America. On a map, Central America looks like a simple corridor. In reality, it's mountains, jungle, heat, and limited infrastructure. Heavy armor struggles. Bridges and roads become natural ambush points. The US already operates bases and cooperation sites in the region, which would become staging areas, but also magnets for attack. Protecting every runway and fuel depot would pull thousands of troops away from frontline operations. Nicaragua likely becomes the first spot where China and Russia quietly assist local defenses, supplying technology, advisors, or intelligence. Even small doses of outside help slow everything down. Then comes Panama and the canal. Securing it is absolutely essential. The canal keeps US naval forces moving between oceans, but it's vulnerable to sabotage, blockages, and cyber disruption. Even if secured, the US inherits permanent responsibility for defending and operating it while under pressure. Belize adds another complication. British troops train there. Any clash risks straining relations with one of America's closest allies. But those same troops could also end up supporting the US as it pushes further south. It all depends on the politics of the moment. The Caribbean. The US Navy could dominate the Caribbean and impose blockades. Many governments would likely cooperate simply to avoid isolation. But European territories change the equation. Dutch and French islands are legally part of Europe. Striking them could trigger EU mutual defense obligations, potentially dragging Europe in. And depending on politics, that could mean either acting alongside the US as a partner or opposing it to protect European sovereignty. South America. There is no direct armored route from Panama into South America. The Darien Gap, swamp, jungle, and zero usable highway physically blocks movement. That forces the US into amphibious and airborne operations into Colombia or Venezuela. That alone multiplies logistics, risk, and cost. Colombia has decades of experience fighting guerrillas. If it resists, the Andes can become a defensive labyrinth. Venezuela has prepared specifically for this type of scenario, relying on militias, urban networks, and foreign assistance to complicate US air and ground operations. Guyana and Suriname might cooperate, but French Guyana is EU territory defended by France. France is a US ally and would probably lean toward cooperation. And in a region where Russia and China both have interests, every bit of allied help saves time, troops, and resources. The Andes. Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile all share the same basic advantage: altitude. Above 10,000 feet, helicopters lose lift. Engines perform poorly, and soldiers struggle with altitude sickness. Supply lines shrink. Rescue operations become harder. Even elite units suffer. Bolivia is the extreme case. It's landlocked, mountainous, and easier to defend than to attack. Destroying infrastructure to deny resources becomes a logical resistance tactic. The US could theoretically take the territory, but doing so would mean heavy damage to mines, rail lines, and power infrastructure, leaving little economic value behind. Peru adds another layer. Chinese-linked ports could be used to move weapons and equipment unless secured quickly, and China's economic stake there could heavily shape what happens next. Chile has a disciplined, well-trained military. It cannot outlast the US forever, but it can make every phase slow, methodical, and costly. Brazil. Everything eventually runs into Brazil. It is massive, industrialized, and partly covered by the Amazon, one of the most difficult environments on Earth for mechanized armies. The jungle hides fighters, degrades equipment, limits air support, spreads disease, and drags operations out indefinitely. Then there are the mega cities, Sao Paulo and Rio. Policing them would require enormous manpower. Criminal networks already operate like localized militias, further complicating occupation. Brazil's submarine fleet would also force the US Navy to divert major resources into constant anti-submarine patrols to protect shipping and carriers. Even if Brazil cannot win outright, it can stretch the conflict beyond what is economically sustainable. By the time the campaign reaches Argentina or Uruguay, exhaustion matters more than enemy strength. The invisible enemies: logistics, money, and home politics. Every additional mile stretches supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, medical equipment, and spare parts must move thousands of miles through terrain perfect for ambushes. Every road needs repair, often multiple times. Every base needs guarding. Economically, the US becomes its own victim. A huge share of its oil, food, and strategic minerals comes from the very countries it would now be invading. Add in likely sanctions from China and other countries, plus enormous war spending, and the result looks less like expansion and more like economic crisis. At home, unrest grows. Tens of millions of Americans have family and cultural ties to Latin America. Protests, political friction, and sabotage risks would absorb security forces needed overseas. The US would still win most, if not all, tactical battles, but the war would slowly erode national stability. So, this scenario produces 3 realistic outcomes. 1. Total conquest, extremely unlikely. Yes, the US could defeat every national army. No, it cannot occupy every population. Manpower isn't there. Money isn't there. Political patience isn't there. Insurgencies never stop. 2. Fortress North America. Plausible. The US takes Canada, occupies Mexico and Central America, controls the canal, and blockades South America. It technically wins, but inherits permanent resistance and long-term resentment across the hemisphere. 3. Quagmire and retreat, most likely. The US advances, burns enormous resources, bogs down in Mexico and the Andes, then withdraws under economic and political pressure. Weaker than before, while its rivals move in to build influence afterwards. Ironically, after the chaos, outside powers like China likely gain influence by helping rebuild. So, could the US conquer both Americas? Militarily, it can defeat every army. But conquest isn't about firepower, it's about whether populations accept rule, whether supply chains hold, whether the economy survives, and whether the occupier can stay indefinitely. And if you want to see what would happen if BRICS attacked the US, check out the video you now see on your screen. Thanks for watching.